Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It's Saturday, September 8th, and today we're going to be talking about some of this weekend's astrology, and in particular, today's Venus square Saturn. Um, Venus will be perfecting its square to Saturn today, so that's going to be the sort of focus of today's talk. But we'll also be talking about the dark moon, the moment of the moon cycle that comes right before the new moon every month. What is the dark moon about? How can we think about this? I think I had 4, maybe 5 natal charts that I worked with in just the past week with dark moons. And so I thought it would make an interesting topic of conversation for today's video blog. So we're going to talk about the dark moon and what that means, how you can think about that, not just today, but every month. We're going to talk just a little bit about the grand Earth trine that's just been passing through. Some people call it a grand Earth trine. It's a kind of modern concept, the idea of a grand Earth trine, but it's always important when you have 3 planets closely aspecting one another in any number of different configurations. And when they're all in the same, the signs of the same element, Earth, Earth, and Earth in this case, Capricorn, Taurus, and Virgo, there's a particular meaning and a particular mood, you could say. And so we're going to talk a little bit about elements in astrology, what you can learn from the elements, and what it really means when we say a grand Earth trine. And then finally, we'll talk about Venus square Mars. And in each of these stages of today's talk, we'll also be looking at some of the spiritual implications. As each of us are on spiritual paths, how can we understand and sort of utilize these transits in dovetailing them into our spiritual path? So that's what we'll look at. And you'll have to excuse me because my throat's scratchy these days. So let's begin with the dark moon. Now, the dark moon, I'll just give you a sense of what's happening with the dark moon first. Excuse me. So the dark moon is in late Leo right now. It's culminating in the very end of Leo, and we'll be moving into Virgo. As the moon is within about 30 degrees of making the new moon every month, we sometimes call this a balsamic moon. You'll hear people talking about balsamic moons. And you'll also hear people talking about the dark moon. So this last 30 degrees before the new moon, basically you can't see the moon. The moon is very, very close to the sun. When any planet gets to within about 15 degrees of the sun, as an average, it disappears beneath the beams of the sun. And this begins a process that astrologers have talked about for thousands of years called combustion. And combustion means that the planet is at its worst, being sort of swallowed, consumed, and burnt up in a sense by the sun. So this could be a potentially negative thing where a planet gets very weakened. On the other hand, in the synodic cycles between all of the planets and the sun, the process of returning back to conjoin the sun is the beginning of a new cycle. And so there's also the special moment when any planet is sort of exactly conjoined the sun, just like a new moon, where the cycle begins again. And there's this idea of cazimi as well, which is when a planet is almost exactly conjoined with the sun to the exact minute. And this is thought of a moment where the planet takes on new life and essentially is born again, rejuvenated. So as the planet is heading into the sun, in a sense, it's dying. Its energy is waning. Its light is losing power. And part of the health of a planet in astrology is connected to the ability to have its own light, its own independent luminosity. So when a planet is heading into the beams of the sun, falling under the rays of the sun and kind of becoming combust, it's a moment that is often associated with death, with rebirth as well, but with death. And so the dark moon in many ways is the sort of quintessential symbol that helps us to understand what combustion means within all other planetary synodic cycles to the sun. So the death process within the moon cycle has often been compared to the death of plants in nature. It's a common analogy, is the cycle of the life of a plant and the moon cycle. Now, this is an obvious connection because the moon is related to agriculture and planting, and you can look at the Farmer's Almanac every year and get a sense of when to plant based on things like the moon cycle. So the moon has always been connected to the waxing and waning of things in nature, things that grow, things that mature, and then things that die. This is the way of the material world, in a sense. This is just what the material world does. So death is a natural part of the cycle of life. Of course, it's usually our least favorite part, but it's a part of the cycling of things. When we get to this very dark stage, it's that place where the deepest death, the deepest release is occurring. In fact, from last quarter moon, where it's half lit up and half dark, all the way down to new moon, this is a time of disintegration that's associated with winter. Seasonally speaking, this is the sort of the stage of the moon cycle that's associated with old age and winter and death. Now, the last quarter moon has more of a harvesting moment symbolism related to it. But the dark moon, the balsamic moon, for example, was traditionally related to things like bloodletting, where you would be draining toxins out of your body in the old medical model by releasing your certain amounts of blood from your body. Don't recommend that. But it's something that I have to say that I had a friend one time. I'm just going to tell this little anecdote to give you guys a sense. I had a friend one time who was on a lot of prescription medications for emotional trauma and emotional problems. And so this cocktail of medicines, however, was affecting them very badly, and they started cutting themselves. And I was there one time for them as a support and resource of, just emotional support as a friend when they were cutting themselves one time. And actually, this has happened to me a few times. It was a sort of bizarre thing. Maybe it's the cancer in me that ends up sort of occasionally being in that position with people that I'm close to. Cancers often end up becoming nurturers on some level. Anyway, so but this one particular friend was cutting themselves, and when we got out of the trauma of it, and we had, and we just got this person help and what have you, and they were off from the medications. And I was studying astrology, and I couldn't help but notice that when they were having this cutting, that it was a dark moon. And I just remember being sort of haunted by the dark moon because I was sort of just learning about moon cycles and things like that. And this person was, I didn't know anything about the old tradition of bloodletting under the late waning moon or the dark moon. But later on, when this person got help and got off of those medications and had changed to a healthier way of treating themselves and seeking health, we were reflecting upon it together. And my friend said, I just felt, I know that I was probably just doing what I was doing because of a chemical imbalance. But what it felt to me like, it was as though I was trying to get the chemicals out of, I was in a state where I thought if I cut myself, I'll get this stuff out of my body. So it wasn't for my friend, and it's different for everybody. I'm not suggesting that everyone who has ever cut themselves has the same idea. But my friend specifically was thinking about this feeling like there was something unnatural in their body and they wanted to release it. And it wasn't until many years later that I learned about the old practice of bloodletting under the dark moon. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. It's interesting that my friend was, in a sense, enacting a very old ritual of trying to cleanse the blood. And of course, it's a complicated instance of that. But I use that story sometimes to just express how deep and dark and detoxifying the dark moon can be. It can be about real surrender and real letting go. That feeling that you have gotten to a space of giving up. It's not giving up like go to the white light, lay down on your yoga mat and listen to the Native American flute music. You know, there's that kind of giving up, which is good. But this is like the giving up where you've reached a place maybe where you're done. You've zeroed out. I actually recognized that kind of moment this morning, and I went on my morning walk, and it's very gray here and rainy, and the temperature has dropped quite a bit. And I was on my morning walk, and I was hitting a place in my own practice of, realizing, I think this happens for people who meditate frequently. Just like sometimes you go really long periods of time where you feel like, gosh, I'm getting kind of good at meditating. I can stay, and for me, it's chanting. I can stay absorbed in the holy names. Like I can really stay with it. And then all of a sudden you'll hit a patch where it's like, you can't keep your mind focused on anything. Your mind is just everywhere. And you're suddenly just like, how arrogant was I to think I had achieved anything? Do you know what I mean? Because here I am back in the same place where I can't steady my mind at all. Or there'll be weeks where you can't keep up with anything. You're just getting battered by your own whims and impulses. Your kind of lesser qualities are taking over. And then finally you get to this point where you're just like, I just kind of suck, like I can't do it. I'm a phony. Or you feel like this is pointless. I can't go on. I'm going to stop trying or whatever. But eventually, even that kind of chatter, that you're hitting the real low of the low, and eventually it just gets silent, and you just sit there with this kind of sadness, or this feeling of like, I'm really at the bottom of something. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be so Shakespearean, right? But something. You just get to the bottom of something and you don't have anything left with it. You're faced with one of your own personal limits, perhaps, or the bottom of a place of sadness or something. And it's funny because in that place you sit there and it's almost like you're not even aware that while you're sitting there, something's just starting to pour out of you. Something is starting to drain out. Some level of honesty has been reached within yourself, and it's just things are just free to leave. And that's kind of what the dark moon is about. The dark moon, I think, offers us an opportunity for that each month. But there's another version of the dark moon, which is where we're going mad, because when that happens, sometimes what the ego likes to do, I know this because I struggle with this, and I'm sure that some of you do too, that as you're going down, as the ship is going down, it's really hard to let it go down. It's you're lucky in a sense if you go down with it and find yourself just tanked sitting there, because that's when it starts draining out. But a lot of the time we start railing against that. No, I don't want to give up. I don't want to let go. No, I'm not going to allow this stuff to seep out. I'm not going to allow for the releasing. And so we fight, we control, we push, we try to conquer. And the dark moon is particularly, in my experience, particularly nasty when we do that around a dark moon, because it's a little bit, it's like madness making. You're stirring up a cocktail of trouble and then drinking it. And when we don't allow something to just rest or deplete or empty or whatever at the end. That's why the dark moon is also traditionally associated with things like sorcery, black magic, witches, and not in the good way, or sorcerers and not in the good way. Because I know there's many people out there, of course, who have shamanic practices and other things like that that are not like that. But in the old world, a sort of simple version of dark, heavy magic and sorcery. That is kind of like dark moon time. On the other hand, the veil is very thin under the dark moon. So sometimes you can also really see through to the other side. Your dreams become more vivid. For example, last night, I had a dream, and I know it lasted a long time because I woke up several different times during the night. I had drank too much tea before bed, not caffeinated tea, but I drank too much tea before, too close to bedtime. So I was like getting up during the night a few times to go to the bathroom. And I noticed that I was having the same dream throughout the night. It was like a continuation of the same dream, and it was spaced apart several hours. And of course, there might have gone different, but it kept coming back to the same dream. And the symbolism of the dream was just really incredible, and I notice a lot between last quarter moon and new moon that my dreams will speak a lot more clearly, that the veil is just a little bit more thin. So you can watch for that as well. So the dark moon has these kinds of qualities to it: surrender, letting go, coming to the bottom of something, letting things seep out. But there's also sometimes the fighting against that which is inevitable, the inability to let go, the inability to die, the inability to accept endings, that can mix up a special cocktail of craziness. So be careful of that right now. Dark moons aren't a great time to start something new. They're a great time to rest, recover, prepare, or to do that deeper, quieter, and sometimes more private work on yourself, or sometimes to spend time in deeper contemplation. Here's something that sometimes isn't said enough. A lot of the times, spiritual life is something that we insert in between lots of things on the to-do list. So we'll meditate, but it's being shoehorned into a really busy day. Or we'll take time for some prayer or some journaling or some downtime or whatever, but we're catching it 30 minutes here or there, whatever, and we're always the engine's just kind of always going. And something that I think can be helpful for us is to really just turn off sometimes. And by turning off, I mean really turning off. No goal-oriented behavior. And sometimes the best processing that we do comes from really being able to think. One of my teachers says that we think a lot, but rarely in a way that's productive, which means that even though people are always thinking, they really don't know how to think. And knowing how to think isn't a class that you take. It's something that you learn by spending long periods of doing it. And to spend a long period of time thinking, you really have to create space for it. Well, a lot of the culture of meditation throughout the history of the world is associated with the life of contemplatives, which means that it's not just about meditating all day long. It's also about creating long periods of time to do things a lot more slowly so that your mind can very quietly, gently, and gradually work on things that it wants to think about. If we don't have time or space for that, we don't have the opportunity to understand what good thinking actually looks like. So too often we end up polarized. We say, oh, my mind's too busy, so I'm going to meditate. And then it becomes an extreme. Oh, I'm having trouble meditating because my mind's so busy, so I can't be a meditator. People are like that. Or they'll say, I struggle because I want to get into a zone of meditation, but then I fall out of it and my mind gets really busy again. And then I go to an extreme. I take an 8-day cleanse or a fast or something. And then I go back and forth between extremes like that. And one of the bridge between the busy life of the mind and the absolute sort of zero idea of meditation is learning how to think over long periods of time where we are slowly giving our minds space to think quietly and gently. Most of the time, we need no music for that. We need one thing at a time that we're doing in our environment, like I'm just doing the dishes right now, or I'm just doing my laundry. And I'm not thinking about what's coming next or whatever. I'm just doing it, and I'm spending some time with my thoughts. Your mind will teach you how to think if you do that. So these are things to also contemplate under this dark moon. All right, so that's a bit about the dark moon this weekend. New moon coming up very shortly, it's tomorrow. So you have the rest of today to maybe take some time to think if you can, or take some time to reach the bottom of something. Um, the next thing that's on the list is there's been a grand Earth trine coming through. Now, grand Earth trines are made between three planets coming to within a degree-based close proximity, if not exact or perfect degree-based trine in all three signs of the same element. So you have a trine from a planet in Virgo to Capricorn and Taurus to Capricorn and Virgo, and Capricorn to Taurus and Virgo. And that kind of trifecta has recently, not perfectly, it's not been completely perfect, but very close, with Saturn and Uranus in an almost perfect trine between Capricorn and Taurus, and then Mercury having just rolled into Virgo, and it's about 2 degrees past right now. I talked about this in August. I gave a talk on like all this Earth energy that's going to be coming through in late August and early September. So I like to make fun of the phrase grand Earth trine because it's just one of those things that drives me crazy, all the elaborate grand aspect patterns. One of the reasons that it tends to drive me crazy, just so that I don't seem like just some kind of oaf, is that I prefer when people understand the basics really, really well, so that there's like real intimacy with very basic things. And oftentimes what I see is people having some grand set of vocabulary without much understanding of the basics. Be like, oh, there's a grand Earth trine coming through my chart this weekend. Oh my gosh, and you're like, well, what does that mean to you? And they're like, well, it's just like so much energy, like. So I always want people to, I always prefer that we keep things really simple, because I feel that sometimes what's lacking is greater depth and greater intimacy with fewer things. That's how I feel about myself. So I do tend to project that into the world, as that's my MO, but that's also part of the flavor of how I teach. So you kind of get to know that about me as you hang around me for a while. And most of the time it's my better self communicating it, but sometimes my grumpy evil angel comes out about that. So anyway, the grand Earth trine, back to this idea of grand Earth trine, suggests a proliferation of Earth energy coming through. Well, let's talk about elemental energy, and let's talk about Earth energy, and how can you understand this in general. So in ancient astrology, one of the things that modern researchers of ancient astrology have suggested, especially Robert Schmidt and others, and one thing that's also present in Indian astrology, is this idea of what are called the winds. Now, there were nautical metaphors in ancient Greco-Roman Hellenistic astrology that were very frequent in a world that was surrounded by the Mediterranean. And so you'll have often imagery that is connected to sailing, like the body. Porphyry talks about in a book that's sometimes translated as Ensoulment. Porphyry is a philosopher / astrologer, talks about the process of the body being built in the womb, like the process of a ship being built, and the soul entering the body upon birth and taking the helm of the wheel of the ship, so to speak, or as Gemini Brett informed me recently, the rudder of the ship. And when the soul comes into the body and takes the wheel, so to speak, the wheel was conceptualized as the horoscopos, the ascending degree. So that's like the wheel of the ship. But there were other nautical metaphors throughout that were throughout the conceptualization of the houses of the chart and the construction of the chart that were there, that are very interesting. And Robert Schmidt has gone to some he's explored this at some depth and at some length for a good portion of his career with Hellenistic astrology. One of the concepts that's also there is the idea of the winds. Now, the idea of winds in the Indian tradition, as I understand it, it was connected to like things like prana, and like that, and the different winds that are also conceptualized as being a part of the body. If you've studied Hatha Yoga, you may have heard about some of that. But at any rate, the winds were also connected to the elemental triplicities, or the trigons, which are the signs that are all of the same element. We don't know exactly how, it's not entirely clear, but one thing that I've experienced that I think makes an interesting connection to this idea of the elements as winds is that, of course, the idea of winds would have been important for sailing. The idea that there are certain kinds of energies coming into your life from certain directions that are influencing the course of your life. And in the most basic sense, the winds seem to have been connected to elements. Now, the elements, that makes sense because the elements are, in some ways, the subtlest sphere of symbolism that we use as astrologers. Sometimes they're used in a manner that's too heavy-handed, in my opinion. But the elements are subtle, and they suggest different kinds of influences that are subtle but pervasive in our lives. For example, in your birth chart, this past week, I kid you not, I did 2 charts. I mean, this was an interesting week where I had 4 or 5 clients, all with dark moons. And then I had, and that happens for astrologers where clients come in waves, certain types of things showing up. They often correspond to things that you're learning about personally as an astrologer, and that's all fascinating. 5 dark moons, and then I had 2 clients come in who had all traditional planets in water signs. Like all, not one was of the traditional 7 were outside of water signs. I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever seen that, let alone twice in a row in a week. Of course, they both came in while the moon was in Cancer, forming a grand water trine with Jupiter, and loose grand water trine with Jupiter and Neptune. So those are interesting things that you pay attention to as an astrologer. Not that you're ever exactly sure what they mean, but it's like, okay, well, there's repetition of patterns here. But one of the things that I noticed in both of the lives of these clients who had all water energy was the way in which so much of the stream of their life and the direction of their life was subtly guided by the theme of water. And that became a big focal point of the conversation, in a sense. So this was a really fascinating thing to observe in the past week. And then it got me thinking about the grand Earth trine and things like that, and going back to this idea of the elements as related to the winds, this idea of winds that were a part of the subtle energy sphere that would be influencing a person's life. So keep all of that in mind, right? That they're acting as subtle influences. In ancient astrology, planets also have, when they're in any given sign, they have what's called a triplicity ruler. So for example, if you were born at nighttime and you had, like, let's say Venus was in a fire sign, then the triplicity ruler of Venus in a fire sign by night would be Jupiter. Jupiter, in other words, has an affiliation with fire signs and the element of fire in the nighttime. Whereas by daytime, the element of fire has an association with the sun. So if you were born at day and Venus was in a fire sign, then her triplicity ruler would be the sun. And triplicity rulers were, one of the ways I like to think about them, one of the ways that they were sort of conceptualized, is like ministers or counselors to the planet. What is a minister or a counselor to a planet? It's someone who has some kind of guiding influence. So you see, the concept is very similar. With triplicity rulers in the old language of dignities, a triplicity ruler gave a subtle form of influence to the planet. So in other words, let's say that your ascendant ruler is Venus and you were born at night. Well, you might have a very, being a Venus, like a Libra or Taurus rising, you may have a Venetian temperament and a Venetian personality on some level, because your ruling planet of the rising sign is Venus. So that would tell us something about your behavior. However, if Venus is in a fire sign in the evening, it gives a subtle influence from the planet Jupiter. It's like there's a pervasive, subtle mood of Jupiter underneath the surface of that Venus. Whereas if it were by day, you'd get a little bit more of a solar Venus. So there were these subtle ideas of subtle influences of the elements and planets affiliated with the elements by day or by night. And those planets were thought of as like counselors or ministers. So that's another thing it's very similar to this idea of winds coming in from some particular direction and offering some kind of influence. So if you take all of that into consideration, then one of the things that I like to draw from all of that is this idea that when you have a confluence of planets in one element really being pronounced, you're getting a little bit stronger. It's still subtle, but you're getting a stronger subtle body, glow from the earth energy, if it's an earth trine, grand earth trine, or from the water energy, if it's a grand water trine, or what have you. So there's a sense of there being the minister that's like blowing the wind, blowing the whisper into our subtle field or something like that is Earth right now. So that's the way you can think about it. I always like to try and educate a little bit as we go. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a weird digression, and hopefully everyone finds that interesting. But what does that mean? Interpretive, like how do we interpret that? Well, what is the minister of Earth saying? The minister of Earth is saying, get things done. I need this to be practical. I need this to be functional. I need this to be more controlled. I need this to be more measured. I need this to be more rational even. Or I need this to be contained or held in a new manner. Or I need to reorganize or restructure something. Or I need a functionally better or different way of doing things. Remember, Uranus is in the mix after all. Or I need some more sophisticated and intelligent way of understanding something. So all of these ways of basically all of these different ideas that I'm speaking to, you could say, are the subtle influence of the earth energy right now. So you think about the influence of Earth and how it's been affecting you. I'll give you some examples. A few days ago, I found this interesting new software that's free, or it's like an app, I guess, called Monday. And it's basically like an online cloud or shared folder of to-do lists for companies. And since my wife and I, we have a manager too for our yoga studio, but between us and the yoga studio and our manager and stuff like that, like it's hard to sometimes all stay connected to the same to-do lists. And I was going a little bit nuts about it, and I need to fix this, And then I found this thing that all happened right as the grand earth trine came through. But after it came through and I was so satisfied with it, I did have a moment where I was like, oh, it's like, there's the minister of earth, like, the wind blowing in my sails coming in from the earth region of the sky. Like there's the earthy winds coming in to fill my sails and push me in a direction. So you can think about it like that, when there's a lot of elements coming through in one direction, that they're kind of pushing you along down the currents according to their impulses and their preferences and their ideas and stuff like that. So containment and practicality, functionality, control. Remember, Earth is cold and dry in nature. And so it's also normal for things to dry out a little bit. That it means sometimes Earth is about consolidation. And so I always notice when there's a lot of Earth energy in the sky that it's a great time to sort of recalibrate, do a little bit of, maybe for right now, doing a little bit of fall cleaning, something like that. And then when the energy, pushes out, there's like the earth energy starts clearing out, I might notice that new things start growing a lot more again. There's like proliferation of lots of new stuff again, especially when water starts getting emphasized. But earth, oftentimes things will slow down and contract a little bit, and that's pretty natural. People also, when things start to contract, especially if you're a fire person, if you have a lot of fire energy, you'll often kind of freak out and try to will something to happen or try to mold things to fit your vision, and that's not always a good idea. When things are contracting, it's often a time to consolidate, to organize, to simplify, to reduce, to eliminate. It's often a time to trim and cut. It's a harvest time to plan, refine, develop structures, work within them, stuff like that. So, all right, so that's the Grand Earth Trine. Last but not least, we have Venus square Mars. That's happening today. So what I want to talk about here first is we know Venus square Mars. I wrote about this earlier in the week. Venus square Mars can bring up things like tension between the sexes, tension between masculine and feminine, yin and yang, however you want to think about that. Venus square Mars can also bring up creative tension, sexual tension, relationship tension. So those are the common things that you can see right now. I jokingly said you won't be sure if you want to, mate with or kill the competition. Joke. The basic reason for that is that when Venus and Mars tangle, there's always something about it that's both competitive and beautiful at the same time. So it can actually be a very nice aspect for riding through conflicts or tension without there being disasters, right? There can be heightened tension, but there can be some feeling of needing to sort of keep the peace or being attracted to that which you are feeling competitive toward or with, or feeling like there's a desire to upend something that you're feeling competitive or jealous about, and then you hold back and you end up appreciating it. And so it's interesting dynamics like that. But there's another concept at work within this square that's really important to know about, and that's what's called a superior square. So when I'm going to try to explain this very briefly because it can be a complicated idea, but you have to think from there's what's called a superior sextile, a superior square, and a superior trine. Oppositions or conjunctions are not considered superior or inferior. But a sextile, trine, or square could be an inferior or superior square or trine or sextile. So the basic thing that defines it is the planet that is in the superior position is the one that's forward motion through the zodiac is moving toward the planet that is ahead of it in zodiacal order. And in a sense, it's facing toward that planet. So for example, Libra comes prior to Capricorn in zodiacal order. So Venus right now is aiming toward Capricorn. So she's like, you could think about it as you're walking down the street, Venus and Mars are walking down the street, and Venus is behind Capricorn, but is looking at Capricorn and going in the direction of Venus and Libra is heading toward or going toward Mars and Capricorn. So Mars in Capricorn, on the other hand, is not currently going toward Libra, right? That would mean it would be going backward through the zodiac. It's going toward Aquarius, and then Pisces, and then Aries. So its motion is going forward, which means, again, if there are two people walking down the street, they're both heading north along, I don't know what, like Park Avenue or something. You're moving north down a street, and you're both going north, but one planet is behind the other and moving closer toward that planet, or moving toward where that planet is currently located, whereas the other planet is continuing forward, in a sense, not looking back at the planet behind it. So Venus right now is what we call in the superior position. You can think about it like this. if you're walking down the street and you're approaching a planet, well, if you were walking down the street and you were approaching a planet, that would be, first of all, that'd just be crazy. So if you're walking down the street and you're about to overtake somebody else, right, who is the other planet in this example, you have the superior position because their back is turned to you, so to speak, right? So as you are approaching them, their energy is coming off from their back, kind of emanating backward toward you. But your energy is intending forward right into their back. So energetically, you're in the stronger position because your energy is going right into their back. They can't see you, and their energy is just streaming off from them. So that stronger energy is the one that moves forward from us in this analogy. And the weaker energy is the one that flows backward from us. Okay. So in these examples of superior sextile squares or trines, the planet that's in the superior position is said to be overcoming the planet that's ahead of it. So as you're walking down the street and your Venus is catching up with Mars, her energy is asserting more and more dominance over Mars because she's in that superior position and she's, in a sense, dominating it. So what that means right now is that within this square between Venus and Mars, Venus has the upper hand. So you can think right now of a typical Venus-Mars square, which would include all of the tensions of Venus and Mars, like sexual or creative tension or relationship, some element of artistic creativity, the masculine, feminine, more in a more intense relationship. Remember, squares are of the nature of Mars. So you can think about that, but then you can think Venus sort of has the upper hand here. Venus is approaching Mars from behind and has the stronger forward kind of momentum over Mars. So it's important because one of the reasons that you may also see the tendency for tensions to be resolved with some element of diplomacy right now rather than bubbling over into something crazy is also because Venus's influence is stronger. So Venus is also in her own sign. Of course, Mars is exalted right now. So they're both very strong in terms of their essential dignity. It's very Mars-like in Capricorn, a very productive and effective and sort of glorified place for Mars. But Venus in Libra is their home temple. So they're two strong Venus-Mars traits right now, but Venus does have the sort of upper hand in the situation. Now that doesn't mean it's just all in all a good thing. There are elements of this that have to be explained. So now what we're going to do is break down some of the nuts and bolts of Venus-Mars on a spiritual plane. What does that mean? Well, Venus in Libra dominating Mars or overcoming Mars in the superior position may mean that there's tension that's coming up and that politeness somehow comes through and takes over, and that, that could be a really good thing. But what I want to talk about on a spiritual level, because we all know it's a nice thing to be polite, most of the time we're taught that since we're little. We know that that's a value or a virtue, to be kind, to be generous, to be diplomatic or whatever. But oftentimes we don't really talk about politeness as the shadow quality of selfishness. And the reason that we have to understand it like this is because Venus, the home signs of Venus are the opposite signs opposite to them are the home signs of Mars. So Mars and Venus are shadows of one another. They can act like opposites that have things to teach each other constantly, and their tension is either more or less tense or relaxed, and that's kind of the dynamic. So politeness can be the shadow of selfishness. If in this world, how you've probably noticed this before, that you may go into a store and you may buy something and you're like, underneath, you're like, I don't like any of the people here. I'm in a bad mood. I just want this thing that I need to get. We've all had days like that. And yet underneath or on the surface, you are acting just polite. You're doing that. You're method acting the polite consumer role. You know what I mean? And there's nowhere where this politeness is tested more than like a long line at Starbucks or something like that. You know what I mean? everyone's being just as polite as can be, when underneath what's raging is everybody's caffeine addiction, which is essentially very self-centered. Like me, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. I want that, I want that, I want that. And on the surface, everyone's like, joking around, like, do you have a bachelor's degree in some kind of liberal arts? I do too. Like, like, joke. But everyone is, being polite as a way for, in sometimes as a way to make everybody feel good about transactions that are happening that are purely selfish or mostly selfish. So that's the potential for the shadow right now. Mars might be in the weaker position and Venus more dominant, but that can also mean that Venus is dominant sort of in the air, whereas Mars is a little bit more covered up. An exalted Mars overestimates its worth, its brilliance, its hard work, its intentions, its desires, what its goal is. It can be like, it can sort of be like the Mars that's just high on itself. William Lilly, who was a Renaissance astrologer, made the point in his famous horary text, Christian Astrology, to point out that exalted planets, especially when they're in the angles, can be indicative of people that overestimate themselves. So you have an exalted Mars right now, and this is at the anaretic 29th degree as well. So there's some real lessons in those very late degrees, Venus at 29 Libra, Mars at 29 Capricorn. And it can be a Mars that's really self-important. And underneath, but all you're seeing is Venus. All you're seeing is a nice veneer, a polished veneer. Politeness can be the shadow of selfishness, and we have to remember that with all of this. Here's the other thing. Dare I say it, right? Because it's one of those things that you can get in trouble for saying. People are really, really trigger happy these days, and that's maybe a bad metaphor, since there's literally such an awful problem with guns as well in our country. But people are really trigger happy these days, and I could reflect on what I think might be related, how that's reflected in the astrology or whatever. But there's a tendency to be really, really reactive. So one of the ways that we often justify rage and selfishness and ego and stuff that we like to sometimes believe that our ego and our anger and our tendency to want to have more power, more greatness, etc. We think that it's better than other people, that our stuff smells different and a little bit better, is by saying, well, what I'm doing is about justice. What I'm doing is about social justice. What I'm really about is about noble, good stuff. And so I have every right to be angry and reactive and inflammatory and like that. And I've seen this in social media the past few years. Of course, the environment that we're in right now, there's so many things that could be said about it, so I don't want to simplify anything. But the point is that we also can very easily think of the jabs that we want to take right now, or the anger that we might have, or the ruthlessness that we demonstrate in how we treat or think or act or speak, as all justified because, well, I believe in something that's so beautiful and just and balanced and true. And who can argue with wanting to advocate for marginalized people, or who can argue with wanting to stand up for a good cause, right? And so the veneer of Venus in the dominant position over Mars right now could also be seen as a way of cloaking oneself or justifying oneself. On the other hand, there can be an actual real sense of social justice. There can be a real sense of wanting to act, Mars, on behalf of something that is just, balanced, fair, true, etc., Venus and Libra. So knowing the difference between those things is not always easy. Now, the other thing that can be a shadow of selfishness is humility. As a Cancer, I have Mercury in Cancer in a real close square with Jupiter and Saturn in Libra. So I often struggle with this as well, which is that we all know a lot of us know, especially in like client satisfaction training that a lot of us have gone through in different jobs that we've had or different public positions that we've had to hold, like teachers or customer service or just anything like that. You learn how to be humble. The customer is always right. You learn all of that, and you learn how to method act humility. I know that that's something that I often walk away from this very show that I do, this programming that I create. I often walk away, and as I'm doing my morning meditation or whatever, where I'm with my family and my wife and my kids and like that, um, I feel sometimes so conflicted. I'm like, well, I know how to method act, kind of the humble, nice spiritual guy thing on my YouTube show or whatever. But when I get into positions outside of that, I find that there are certain areas of life where it's much, much, much harder to not be just a total selfish jerk. You know what I mean? And that's not to say that I consider myself like to be a total phony or anything either, but I think that we all struggle with that, where there's some parts of our life where we know how to method act humility. We know how to method act like, oh, I'm just this simple, kind, namaste everyone, or whatever. But it's really hard. It's actually really, really challenging to remain authentically humble, because authentic humility doesn't turn off and on. You know what I mean? It becomes steady. And I can't claim to have that in my life. And so at the very least, we're all dealing with separating out sort of streams of authentic humility from those that are really just acting. And so humility often is the shadow of selfishness. Humility loves to look good, sound poised, sound so gentle and meager, sound so nice and considerate. But again, sometimes humility done in a way that isn't coming from the real fiber of inner work that we've done is like a cover band, right? Or like a celebrity impersonator. There's something that's satisfying about a cover band. Like I went a few years ago. I'll never forget the very first time. I used to make fun of my dad because he had a record player and like CDs were cool. They were becoming a thing. And I'd be like, Dad, you're listening to a record player. Now I'm like, how cool is my dad? But he was listening to his record player and he had headphones kind of like these. And he was sitting on the couch one night, just sitting there. And I was like, Dad, whatever, you're such a nerd. Like, what, you're listening to records. Like, come on, get with the program or whatever. And I was teasing him about his music too. Like, what are you listening to? Some kind of old man music. I didn't really know what my dad even listened to so much. My dad he said, come here. And okay. And he said, sit down. And so I sat down next to him. I said, I want you to hear something. And he put the headphones on my ear and he went over and adjusted the needle to the correct track. And I listened. He was listening to Led Zeppelin 4, and I got to hear Stairway to Heaven for the first time, which at that time like totally blew my mind, right? So I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And then my dad proceeded to start teaching me to play guitar pretty soon after that. Anyway, I look back at that though, and speaking of thinking of humility, and I think, gosh, my dad was probably because he was a preacher, he was a minister who had like closet interests in things like Led Zeppelin. So, but he, so he had this sort of like, he was very humble about his rock and roll though. So I think about that. Anyway, I took my wife to see a Led Zeppelin cover band a few years ago, and it was like so entertaining and wonderful. But I also left feeling I had drank a Diet Coke. Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess like there's some kind of chemical in here that's really not good. And like, no offense to cover bands, because I'm so impressed at what people can do, right? But the same idea is there for us, that humility loves to look good, sound poised, but it's like a cover band or a bad imitation if it's not coming from the real substance of having been humbled, or having submitted ourselves to instruction or guidance from something bigger, or having been broken down a little bit and found some new version of ourselves that was a healthy, new, but more modest version. So humility can be like that. Venus over Mars can also assert a degree of humility that's not really authentic. On the other hand, imitation, as they say, is a form of flattery. So they say, when I was in graduate school for creative writing, one of the things that we had to do was we had to basically learn how to imitate the styles of writers that we really liked. I did an MFA and an MA in creative writing. And in both programs, I learned to read a lot of different authors, find authors that I really liked, and then imitate their styles. The reason that I did this, or that we were sort of encouraged to do this kind of work, was because what happens when you imitate something is that eventually you get to a point where you become sort of good at it. And then once you become a little bit better at imitating something, you get a little sick from it. That's the only way I can explain it. Suddenly you start saying, now I'm really, I can tell, I'm method acting this imitation thing to the point where I'm losing track of myself a little bit, and you start feeling sick. If you ever want to see a great movie that is all about a spiritual breakthrough that happened as a result of method acting, I think it's called Andy and Me, and it's about Jim Carrey's method acting of Andy Kaufman in the film Man on the Moon, and it really provoked a kind of spiritual transformation for him that's pretty incredible. But the same is true for all of us. We imitate spiritual people that we meet that have qualities that we know to be virtuous spiritually. In some ways, imitation is the best form of flattery, and we imitate these people, and we try to do our best version of Thich Nhat Hanh, or, you know what I mean? Like, you'll try to do your best version of being that person, and you try to method act that role. And experiences in life have a way of bringing us to desire this at all. So it's not that becoming a humble person isn't filled with some positive method acting and imitation either. But you'll start to build up some sense of like, okay, now I'm just trying to be this other person. I'm trying to be my teacher, or I'm trying to be like this, or I'm trying to be like that. And it starts feeling inauthentic. But that dissonance, as that builds, it forces you back in on yourself, and it helps you to discover your own voice. It helps you to discover the authentic version of whatever it is. But all the spiritual virtues, including humility, work that way. So we have to be open to imitating the virtues we see in other people and teachers and things around us, spiritually speaking. But we also eventually have to take the risk of figuring out who we are. The reason I'm mentioning that in the context of Venus and Mars is because Venus in Libra sometimes has a really hard time, especially when she's dominant over Mars, of tipping the scales. I prefer balance. But in order to take a risk to figure out who you really are, that's different from just the method acting of something nice, beautiful, polite, kind, wise, balanced, whatever, is you have to take the risk of tipping the scales. You have to take the risk of asserting something that comes only from you. That is not separate from being humble. It's part of so in other words, humility and taking some risk of asserting yourself are also not, they're not mutually exclusive. So that is part of the process of becoming authentically gentle, kind, compassionate, humble, modest, is that we have to do so in a way that's eventually not just an image of that we're method acting, but something that we've taken the risk to assert and cultivate on our own. That's a very fine balance of its own to strike, but it's a different kind of balance to figure that out, to figure out the risk versus, just staying in the safe, veneered, polished act. That figuring out how to do that balance is really tricky, because you start asserting yourself too much, and it's very easy to you say, God, I was better when I knew how to be very polite. You know what I mean? So finding authentic politeness, finding authentic kindness, beauty, grace, diplomacy, tact, concern, those things take messing up. Somehow the two are entailed with one another. Getting it right is also something that Venus in Libra, and square to Mars and Capricorn can be also about getting it right. I want to get this right. I want to do this right. I want to accomplish this thing. I want to amass the accomplishments or the titles or the whatever. As an astrologer, for example, I know that one thing that I'm tempted to do over time is to amass credentials and amass books that I've read. Like that, you can go on and on and on trying to build up some sense of the resume or what have you. Getting it right is also not the foundation of any relationships in life that I know of. So getting it right or amassing accomplishments or whatever, does that work? If you apply that to the idea of relationship, does that work? I mean, when was the last time that you had a relationship with any human being that mattered to you, where you sat down and you thought, okay, how can I objectively accomplish 15 things that will make this relationship great? Do you know what I mean? Like, people don't usually think that way about relationships, or if they do, the relationships, we would say, probably don't last or aren't very deep. And yet, so frequently, we treat our lives that way, which means that on some level, we do not have a relationship with ourselves, and that we don't have a relationship with even our dreams and goals. Because dreams and goals are also living things. And all that we want or desire in life, when it's treated really objectively like that, we think, oh, there's just a plan or a list, and then I'll get there or I'll do it. You're stripping that process of relationship. Relationship doesn't usually work on crossing off all the to-dos and amassing accomplishments and things like that. So getting it right, looking right, those aren't really the foundations of lasting relationships. Similarly, if our goal of spiritual life is perfection, and we think, well, if I just check off this list of things, then our realization, whatever it is, will not be based on relationship. My spiritual paradigm is based on the idea that reality is relationship. And so if I'm denying relationship as a part of the goal of my spiritual life, I'm not actually living a spiritual life. Sometimes we call that spiritual materialism. So at any rate, practice also makes perfect, on the other hand. A lot of the times we say it's all relational, so there's no objective work that I have to do. But Venus and Libra can also, as much as it can be the Venus and Libra, Mars and Capricorn can be like, just check off the to-do lists and then you'll have the credentials, and like, ugh. But Venus Mars square can also be about the way that we get it right by practicing over a long period of time. Practice makes perfect. I think that that's a functional phrase. You know, I don't think of that as a literal thing. How can, for example, I think of Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that we're eternal souls who were never born and will never die. When you think about that, it's, in a sense, behind and through everything in life is the idea that you can't become anything more or less eternal than you already are. And so the entire spiritual paradigm of improving something is, in a sense, functional. Just like you say, I want to work on my relationship or improve my relationship. It's a functional phrase, not so literal exactly. But anything that you want to practice on and make perfect is usually a little by little kind of thing over a long period of time, right? So not a maintenance of a perfect image over a long period of time. So for example, one of the definitions of beauty in our world is that beauty doesn't age, beauty doesn't change. So plastic surgeries and, you know, the makeup industry and men in the, you know, the bodies, and like all this different stuff that we all have, all walks of life, that is trying to maintain an image of beauty forever that doesn't change, that always looks good, that's always fresh. And the maintenance that goes into that, isn't it in some ways just so heartbreaking to think that the maintenance of that image is not at all what the real definition of beauty is. We all know this. This is something you learn by the time you're like 7, you know? You learn this in school when you're little. Mr. Rogers tells you this. You're loved just because of who you are. And And so maintaining a perfect image over a long period of time is sort of the societal emphasis, and that can be very Venus and Libra square Mars and Capricorn, just the ruthlessness of like maintaining that image. But on the other hand, as we all know, practice making perfect is a little by little thing that happen, a little by little kind of thing that happens over a long period of time. So if you want to perfect anything, it means that you really, what we're saying is, when we say practice makes perfect, is that you cultivate a relationship of trying to improve something, and it's the relationship that helps the improvement happen. Because you have to, because everything is dual in this world. So to improve something over time usually involves going back and forth between opposites, back and forth between opposites. And slowly something beautiful starts to emerge from the constant tension between those opposites, which is why Carl Jung talked about the idea of individuation frequently in terms of a constant relating of the tension of the opposites. So practice makes perfect is a relationship. That's the idea. And that is something that Venus and Mars can also give us, and Venus can emphasize that right now. Say, be patient for the long haul. If you want anything to be beautiful, you have to develop a relationship with it and work on it over a long period of time, not just try to get it up to some level and then maintain it so it looks perfect. How about this one? Sometimes we try to do more than we're qualified for, or we try to do less than we're qualified for, right? So Venus, Mars is also about finding the ideal balance of what we're capable of and what we're not, and finding the sweet spot where we're working within our capacity. It's very hard to do that. It's actually, I think, one of the most difficult things to figure out, what am I capable of? What am I not capable of? Knowing that and trying to just live somewhere close to that middle space. Is that not so hard? I think it's very difficult for all of us. I'll be ready later if I work hard enough. I'll clear my way to the balanced spiritual lifestyle. So a lot of times we also say to ourselves, I got to do all of this stuff. I got to get like this, and this. I have all of these things that I have to take care of first. And then after I take care of all of them, then I'll be ready for self-care or more intimacy, or in my relationships, more care for my family, more care of my spiritual development. If I first I can just get all this stuff done, then there will finally be this oasis, this resting place at the end where I'll just be walking in the garden of life, and like, I'll be like enchanted, and the world and I will be like that. The thing is, though, is that balance, real balance, is found, made, cultivated through the blood, sweat, and tears of learning to find balance now. It always starts now. And how could you possibly cultivate real balance without learning how to balance, right? And so a lot of the times we delude ourselves by thinking, well, I'll be balanced once all of the hard stuff is out of the way. But the hard stuff is actually where you learn to be balanced. So one of the things that we say in our yoga classes is, it's yoga practice, not yoga perfect. And we say that because balance is cultivated in every moment, in realizing today is the most important day of my spiritual practice. Today is the most important day of my commitments to the things that really matter in my life. Whatever else might be going on around me, I'm committed to showing up today for it. That's where the balance is actually cultivated. It's not, well, if I just plow forward through all of this stuff, then I'll get to that stuff later. And figuring out how to be in the trenches, that's Mars and Capricorn, like how to be in the trenches with your spiritual life, how to just make the walk that you take, where you're like, okay, I have only half an hour today. Sorry, Adam, it's dark moon, I know, but I got a ton of stuff to do, and I don't have time to just sit and teach myself to think for hours. I got stuff to do. Okay, how can you be in the trenches, blood, sweat, and tears a little bit? And even if you're going on a 30-minute walk and that's all you have for the day, even a 20-minute walk and that's all you have for the day. And during that whole time, you're just thinking, God, I'm thinking about what's coming next. I'm not even enjoying this. I'm not even enjoying this. Can you just take even just one moment where you say, I'm so thankful that even though I can't enjoy this, I'm taking a walk. There's something about Mars that needs to fight a little bit. and something about Venus that says, spiritual life shouldn't be about fighting. It shouldn't be about like grit and grime, right? But no, sometimes we have to work out our salvation with sweat and blood and tears and gunk. And that's just part of it. So we can't think, well, balance will come later. This all will come later. Finally, our attractions come and go very quickly. So the test of real attraction to anything, Venus, Mars, is the ability to maintain an attraction through ups and downs over a long period of time, so that your attraction is cultivated with a kind of trust that the moments when your attraction is waning for something, you know it will wax again. And when it waxes again, it'll be like a new wave of affection and attraction that comes into my life. That's the faith of being in relationship to anything that we're attracted to, is the trust that the separation from the attraction is as important as the reuniting, and that they go in cycles and circles, and that you have to stay with the process. You can't let it go. You have to stay with it. That's how we forge real lasting attraction to something versus whims. A lot of the times we mistake freedom for whims. We think, well, I have free will. I'm a self-determined being. I'm co-creating my own reality. But we never really look at how easily we are influenced by things and how easily our attractions come and go to all sorts of different things. And so trying to maintain an attraction over a long period of time to something, what to speak of the spiritual source that we come from, or the reality of our soul and its life, but just anything in life that is superficial, like trying to maintain an attraction for, our kids or our spouse or our job or, our family members or whatever the things that we try to maintain attractions for. Again, what to speak of our spiritual life, we can't maintain those things unless we learn to develop a taste for something. Developing taste over a long period of time, developing attraction over a long period of time, requires the test of commitment. That's a part of Venus and Libra and Mars and Capricorn. This is the etymological roots of the word taste. The first time I ever heard someone really do a lot of work with etymologies was James Hillman. And I really like the way he works with etymologies. Here's some of the etymological roots of the word taste. A small portion given. A small portion given. How do you develop a taste for something that can see you through the ups and downs of a relationship, which is because you are able to stick with something and keep with an attraction over a long period of time because you have a taste for it. A taste is developed. A taste is developed in small portions given. So you have to learn how to develop taste by narrowing in on small things and savoring and saying, I feel this. My palate as a being can differentiate and take joy and pleasure in small things that are given. That's how you also have to develop taste. Here's another etymological root: discernment of what is excellent. But discernment is careful. Discernment is very careful. Taste is active, deciding, choosing, changing, arranging. So in order to develop staying power in relationships and things that we're attracted to, whether that's spiritual life or a partnership, we also have to be able to choose, change, arrange, move things around so that the taste and the savoring is maintained. And that takes a kind of careful discernment. The power to feel is part of the etymological root of taste. Susceptibility of impression. So we have to be careful about how susceptible we are to impressions around us, to be able to withstand and tolerate impressions that want to come in and steal our taste or attraction for something that we're trying to remain committed to. Also, the word taste is related to the word to handle, to evaluate, or to choose. Hindus recognized 6 principal varieties of taste with 63 possible mixtures, and the Greeks had 8. And another etymological root of taste is to know by experience, to know something by experience. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna also says that people try to come to me through knowledge. And but when when they come to me, basically what he says, when they come to me through the heart, I give them the knowledge that they need. So same idea is that developing a taste is in some ways also based on faith. We develop a taste in the heart, we stick with the taste in the heart, and then the intelligence about how to maintain, grow, and develop that attraction, that taste, that commitment to something that we love, it comes into the heart naturally over time. So I hope that this was interesting for everybody today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions, and we'll be done. Okay, lots of comments here. I don't know if I can go all the way up. What happens when a planet is retrograde in regards to a superior square? The analogy breaks down. Same idea, though. If a planet is retrograde and the two planets are coming into a square, the superior one would still have the upper hand. Maybe there's something else that could be said about that, but I've never, practiced with it enough to know. Venus square Mars, somebody said, makeup sex. Yeah, that's a funny way of thinking about it, definitely. Also, does the inherent speed of the two planets affect the superiority also, such as a slower planet being superior by position, yet it will? Okay, I'm going to skip over that one because it's a little too complex, but Tina, we can address that in class. Obama's speech yesterday. Oh, I didn't see Obama's speech yesterday, so I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Speaking truth here, guilt of the humility method acting as well. You are not alone, sir. Yeah, Cancer is also or Spencer is also a Cancer, which is I think we may share that a little bit. Again, I was thinking, but Billy Corgan, the Smashing Pumpkins lead singer, said, "What is the thing that annoys you most about Cancers?" Oh, they think that they're warming everyone with their sunshine. So it's like we can all like act the role of the great mother when we're Cancers, I guess. I'll just have to look at the number of spiritual leaders going down at the moment. I guess I'm not aware of which spiritual leaders are going down right now. Let's see. Donna says, I resonate with the humble face in my job and the juxtaposition with some of my private moments. I recognize that this was happening before. Yeah. Someone says yes to Led Zeppelin. Can't fake it till you make it reverence. Yes, I think I mentioned that when I talked about imitation. Kenosis is hard work. Absolutely. Singers do the same thing until they find their own style. Yeah, good. Yeah. Sherilyn says, this is not the droid you are looking for. Yeah. I did that with Buckley, eventually had to move on and let it go. Oh, Spencer, that's right. And I forgot that you did that. And your covers of him were amazing and absolutely beautiful. Spencer is actually an incredible musician, singer-songwriter, but also has performed at tribute concerts to Jeff Buckley. So check that out. Check out his work. I ingested the essence and then had to transmute it into something else. Well, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the idea. At what point do we all realize that we were just method acting as Adam Ellen Bus? That's funny. Yeah. Well, you wouldn't want the crazy making that comes with it. So anyway, these are big steps you were speaking about. Yeah, not to say that I've taken any of them. But anyway, might work for golf. Yeah, perfection, I guess you're probably talking about there. Yeah, but even golfers wane. You know what I mean? Like mysteriously, like Tiger Woods is a great example. And then they wax again, I guess. Hopefully he'll come back. Maintenance of image is exhausting, nor a good use of energy. This is exactly what I've been struggling with lately. Well, hopefully, I hope this helped then. Okay, good. Okay, great. Well, that's what we've got for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody.